part of the, thanks. This session will take up an important piece of that discussion that is aimed at helping us identify another way forward to get away from this sort of compulsive commitment to markets, despite the fact that they've demonstrably failed to do what needs to be done. So before I introduce our opening speakers, I just want to also give a reminder to the speakers to please speak slowly and clearly for the interpreters so that they can try to keep up and convey as much of what we're saying as possible. And with that, I want to hand over. I've still got a question about whether we have Roz Foyer opening the meeting. Irene, is that
No, I think we're going to go straight to Sean with the framing.
Right. Great. Okay, good. Then in that case, I will introduce my colleague, Sean Sweeney. Sean is the coordinator of QED, also based at the School for Labor and Urban Studies in New York. And Sean, I think, is going to have some opening remarks to sort of frame this discussion and anchor it. So Sean, over to you.
Great. Thanks, John. Can everybody hear me okay? That's great. I think the reason we're doing this meeting is because there is such a period of this. We're in a period of some kind of turbulence, needless to say, at all levels, and obviously the COVID pandemic it seems to have shifted the narrative at the global level and weakened the ideas that have dominated really for 30 years. And we know that those ideas are around and to paraphrase Prince Charles, the need to mobilize the private sector because they are the only ones who can deliver on such things as global public goods. And although I don't think His Royal Highness made reference to global public goods, that's been the general logic, that if there are public goods, then what better means of achieving those public goods except through the market? And we see it through carbon trading, where they've created they're trying to create a market for something, and because that's the only way it can be done. In this case, pollution permits and the right to pollute. And what we've done as a movement over the last 20 years is, first of all, we tried to fight the neoliberal agenda. Attacks on the social wage, attacks on the welfare state, defense of public services. And here, of course, there's been the exemplary role of PSI in defending public services throughout. But a general pessimism, I think, was across the movement that we were fighting a losing battle, that everything was going to be privatized, and maybe we would get away with keeping water public, but essentially we were on the defensive. Then fast forward to around about 2008, 2009, and the great financial crisis. The emerging out of that was the whole idea of green and inclusive growth, that the recovery would be about transitioning to a new form of capitalist political economy based on, again, the market, but in this case, more prominence to public-private partnerships and the role of government as facilitators, as enablers of this transition. And then along comes COVID, and we've got this kind of great reset, build back better, a new type of stakeholder capitalism, which I think seems like a variation on what was happening in 2012 with the World Bank and green inclusive growth. And we see the trade unions at the global level a little confused, in my opinion, and or at least the present company are the notable exception. And with PSI and ITF, that's the Transport Workers Federation, have been putting forward in far more coherent way the need for a public goods approach to services, including transport and essential services. Now, I think the period we're in at the moment is that the unions are, I think, struggling to deal with the fact that the green growth model has not been very productive in terms of producing the millions and millions of green and jobs and decent work that was anticipated or at least hoped for a decade ago. And that there are more and more problems with the neoliberal approach to climate and energy. We've seen growing levels of ambition in terms of targets, but the questions of implementation remain very unresolved. So on the climate debates and the general transition debates, we're seeing, I think, the emergence of a major crisis in that approach. But has the trade union narrative and the left generally been able to keep up with these changes? We've noticed in our work with CHUED that there's still a tendency to think that the transition is inevitable and that unions need to have a seat at the table. And if we play our cards right with certain fractions of capital, the more far-sighted, we will be in a better position to rebuild the trade union voice and the worker voice in this transition. So I think that what we're trying to do with this discussion and the report John mentioned, the interim report, interim trade union report on a public energy future, it's developed a position, if you like, or a discussion on global public goods that seems to be intersecting with what is happening in one or two other places. The Secretary General of the UN has just produced a report a couple of months ago saying if we need global public goods approach should be is necessary in terms of pandemic prevention and response, but it's also needed for climate protection. We've seen at the global level problems with the whole intellectual property regime, and then what does that mean in terms of pushing a just energy transition anchored in public ownership. So I think I'll conclude by saying it would be important, if we're going to pivot as a movement towards, or help work together to pivot towards a new narrative, that we know what it is and what it isn't. And that's why I think Richard's work at UNCTAD has been very, very important. I first came across Richard's work about a year and a half ago when David Boys, who was on this call, Deputy General Secretary of Public Services International, and was saying, this is important. We need to engage in this and work together in developing this new narrative. And I think what we've been doing around trade unions for energy democracy is to try to break unions away from this sort of going along with the green growth model in the hope that one day there'll be a global carbon price, one day there will be job creation. And instead of calling for more ambition and more political will, actually developing some programmatic content for this new narrative around energy transition and workers' issues in particular. So this is a very much an exploratory discussion on how we intersect, or should we intersect with this. And I know in my informal conversations with Richard in recent months, I think the jury is still out to some extent on whether we are at a tipping point or turning point in history, as some have suggested, that there's a new Bretton Woods moment, and there will be a realignment, both at the level of ideas and at the level of policy. Or not, or is this just a re-warmed up different version of, and the whole kind of great reset language of the World Economic Forum? It sounds, and this idea that, oh, we're no longer market fundamentalists. We went a bit over the top there, but we did manage to save the world from terrible recessions caused by profligate spending by governments and lack of fiscal discipline, but we kind of went a bit overboard, and now we're in a new situation and we don't have to be market fundamentalists anymore. We can be stakeholder capitalists, and everybody can have a seat at the table and we can work this out together. That's generally where we think the narrative is going, but are we in a position to put something different forward and organize around it in these multilateral spaces? Because it would be really helpful, I think, for the work we're doing in the trade unions on the progressive side of trade unionism to have something to anchor what we're saying and what we're doing. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Sean. I'm not going to spend any time intervening here other than to mention that I have placed links in the chat to the short program that we worked to develop off of the interim report that we've mentioned there. It's available in English, Spanish, and French. I suspect most people on the call will be familiar with it, but just so folks know in case they're not. But I will hand over now to Richard Kozel-Wright, whom Sean also mentioned. We've had a number of discussions with Richard and people in his office, his department at UNCTAD recently. Richard is the director of the Division of Globalization and Development Strategies at UNCTAD. And Richard, I will hand over to you.
John, thank you very much. And thanks to Sean and to TUAD for the invitation. I mean, just listening to Sean, I mean, our trajectory is very similar, I think. I mean, obviously we come from a developing country perspective, but the trajectory that he described in his opening remarks is very similar to kind of the trajectory of UNCTAD over the last 3 or 4 decades, really. You know, from our high point where we were instrumental in backstopping developing countries around the idea of a new international economic order back in the 1970s that was derailed, and that effort was marginalized as the advanced economies shifted to a neoliberal agenda, which was both anti union and anti-developing country independent, or at least a kind of independent agenda for developing countries. And that's not an accident, of course. I mean, the world we've had over the last 40 years has been dominated by a kind of neoliberal policy hegemony and by the power and influence of a highly mobile and often predatory form of private capital. And both have worked. I think those two forces have worked to reshape the global economy, certainly in a way that has been detrimental to most developing countries, but also to organized labor at the same time. And I guess, you know, a lot of what we're trying to do and think through is how, from our perspective, and this is the conversation we've been having with Sean, how from our development perspective we can find common ground with organized labor to kind of push back against those forces. And I guess the climate challenge has provided an obvious point of commonality here to think about both a counter narrative and the possibilities for countervailing alliances and countervailing power to really to push back, I think, against organized capital. I mean, when I look at the discussions around the new international economic order, which were a bit before my time, I have to say, in UNCTAD, organized capital seems much more powerful today than it was 40 or 50 years ago. I mean, the new international economic order did make in its brief period some important headway in trying to reshape the rules of the global economy. The developing world today is nowhere close to having either that organizational strength or the counter narrative that is required to confront the inequities and insecurities and instabilities of this hyper-globalized world we are in. And that makes to some extent our life difficult. But it is also true, as I think Sean hinted at, that since the global financial crisis, there has been the emergence of counter narratives of some kind. I mean, you know, the global financial crisis did expose the serious limitations of neoliberal hegemony. It did reveal again the way. I mean, having been told that there is no alternative, having been told that the state is an impotent instrument for positive change. I mean, in many respects, the global financial crisis proved both of those things wrong, but it was surprising how successful the what has now been called the Wall Street consensus actually was able to recapture the policy high ground, despite the damage and destruction that had been caused by themselves. It was clearly a private capital driven crisis. But in the meantime, there have been alternatives that have emerged, and we've used the notion of a global Green New Deal as a way to try and think of a counter narrative and a set of alternative policies that could affect or challenge both the inequities that have emerged under neoliberalism, and also to provide a framework for linking that to meeting the global climate challenge, both its mitigation and its adaptation dimensions. And to some extent, I think the pandemic has reinforced those opportunities. It's been a very ambivalent experience in a way. Clearly, the pandemic revealed just how unprepared economies, societies were to meet this kind of external threat. No one came through the pandemic very well, but it also exposed again how determined, if determined, how the state can mobilize resources on a phenomenal scale to deal with that kind of shock. I don't need to go through the numbers in terms of the resources that have been mobilized by advanced economies to meet the shock, to do things that hadn't been dreamed of a decade earlier, kind of notions of a universal a basic income dictating to elements of private capital about what and where they should produce, etc. I mean, these were not conceivable ideas a decade ago, and although not on the kind of scale that or with the kind of intent that we would like to see, that they're another kind of break in the armor of neoliberalism. Of course, what the crisis has also exposed is the difference between advanced and developing countries in this regard. The capacity of most states in the South to do what the advanced economies have done to protect their citizens against the downside of the pandemic, have been very starkly exposed, and multilateralism has failed to kind of step up to the plate in response to the pandemic. I mean, that's been particularly true with the vaccine question, the rollout of the vaccine, and what many people now refer to as vaccine apartheid. And the whole question, which again has really, I think, has done an important job of exposing the way in which the current global economy has become dependent on intellectual property protection for what amounts to a kind of rent-seeking behavior of large corporations, not just in the pharmaceutical sector, but across many sectors of economic activity. But also the pitiful response of the multilateral system to the financial pressures that developing countries have faced as a consequence of the crisis. The efforts of the G20 in terms of debt service suspension, the ability of the IMF and the World Bank to channel resources on a meaningful scale to countries and to do so in an appropriate way. And these have I think been viscerally exposed by the pandemic. So for us, the global Green New Deal, I think, offers an opportunity to rethink the international architecture, which itself, to some extent, is rooted in the original New Deal language and mindset, but has drifted a very, very long way from what the original intent of the architects of post-war multilateralism were looking to achieve. So that, in a broad sense, is how we come at this challenge. I think within the world of multilateralism, it's we are outsiders in the sense that for us this is a systemic problem. I mean, that there is a problem with the rules of the game that are hardwired into creating outcome, the kind of inequities and insecurities that we see across, not just in the developing countries, but in advanced economies as well. And these are not accidents or missteps. These are political choices that have been made. The rules are designed in such a way as to create these problems. It's not about people being left behind, which is the kind of popular way in which this is framed in much of the multilateral discourse. These are a necessary consequence of the rules that have been rigged to favor privileged corporations and high wealth individuals at the top of the pile, and that of course makes our lives quite different. And this is, and in a way, this was the language of the new international economic order too. So we're going back in a way to try and rethink from a development perspective, the need for a new international economic order in light of the new challenges that have been thrown up both by hyperglobalization and by the climate challenge. And if our perspective is to have any sort of traction, I don't think, unlike the new international economic order, I think progressive forces need to coalesce to be able to challenge the concentration of economic and political power that has evolved over the last 40 years. Developing countries, I don't think, can do this by themselves. The role of trade unions as a necessary ally of developing countries is necessary. There are lots of tensions in that, or potential tensions and bottlenecks in that relationship. Civil society has a critical role to play. We need a much more diverse alliance, I think, than was true of the new international economic order project. If we're going to advance something like a global Green New Deal or the role of global public goods as part of that New Deal. So I think we've reached a point where, I guess traditionally UNCTAD's narrative is very much about it's a cross-country narrative. It's about intergovernmental relations, but I think there's a realization that you can't meet these challenges through that kind of lens alone, and we need to have what amounts to a kind of class analysis and to a narrative that kind of links the inequities across countries with the inequities within countries, and I think that's at least how I understand the efforts of the global Green New Deal. And I think it's where we have a lot of commonalities with the efforts of TUAD in the work that Sean and others have been doing, and PSI as well. We've worked closely with PSI on issues around indebtedness, for example. So I think I think there's real opportunities to forge that kind of alliance. But listening to the discourse in here in Glasgow, and listening to and worrying about what might come out of the negotiations in Geneva in a month's time in the WTO. I mean, this is a real fight, because the forces of reaction, or the forces that want to maintain business as usual, despite all the damage that they have caused, are as strong as ever, if not stronger in some cases than they were a decade ago. And so the need to constantly push and to refine the narrative, but to use that narrative to build stronger alliances, I think is going to be critical if we're going to come anywhere close to dealing with not only the climate challenge, but the wider development challenge that is wrapped up with the Sustainable Development Goals as well. Let me leave it there, Sean.
Great. Thank you very much, Richard. That's very useful and broad, and I think in some ways even provocative or challenging set of remarks. And I know there's going to be a lot of interest, or I think, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I think there would be a significant interest from a lot of us to continue to have, more sense of concretely how we would begin to advance some of these discussions involving the unions in these deliberations about how to address these sort of multi-dimensional inequities that you referred to across countries and within countries as well. And obviously that's part of why we're here today. So I've also, just to flag for people, I've put links into the chat for a couple of pieces from UNCTAD on the Global Green New Deal, the Geneva Principles, which I think was the first sort of initial framing document, and then a piece on how to finance, just for future reference. We'll stay focused on speakers for now, but so people have those in case they're not familiar. And if there's something more recent that we should put in as well, Richard, please let us know in some way, and we'll get those out. With that, then I want to turn to Rosa Pavanelli, our next speaker. Rosa is the General Secretary of Public Services International. We've worked increasingly closely with PSI for a number of years, but increasingly so over this past year, especially with David, the Deputy General Secretary, but always pleased to have Rosa available for discussions like this, and thrilled that she can join us today. So Rosa, I'll hand to you.
Good morning, everyone. Good day. I don't know where you are located. Thank you very much, John, and thanks to Sean and Richard for their remarks that are really touching on the contradiction of the phase we are confronted with. I think that the debate that is ongoing in the COP26, along with the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic, are showing how we are completely involved, completely absorbed in a crisis that is not simply a climate crisis, a health crisis, an economic crisis, but is a systemic crisis. And at the very end, I have the feeling, even stronger now after having listened to your presentation today, that we are at the breaking point of the development system that led the world in the past 50 decades since the Second World War, and that changed deeply after the financial crisis of 2008. With the growing power of corporates. But I would say that what is ongoing, the increasing difference in development opportunities for developing countries and the global north is simply the continuation of a colonial system, of an imperialistic system that has been based on the exploitation of natural resources, workforce, people for century and century, and it simply changed its physiognomy, its name, but unfortunately the system is still there. And the growing power of corporates is reducing the democratic space, the democratic base of our societies, even if we continue to live or to participate in a system where people is given the possibility to elect the governments or take this measure. The reality is that governments have seen their power reduced further and further over the years, and left this power to the financial system, to corporates, to lead the process. I don't have to explain to you what it means under the WTO trade agreements or in the plurilateral agreements that are multiplying around the world and creating even more distance to the possibility to reduce poverty and enhance justice and equality around the globe. You have mentioned several times this new aspect of this global cooperation based on a different approach from the multilateral method that were the spirit and the aim of the international institutions and the UN system. And even the language is changing. No, we are within the UN, we are no longer talking about multilateralism, but a new way of participation that is based on multi-stakeholderism, where a big organization such as a global union federation count as much as small NGOs or organizations representing very limited vested interest, but where, most important, those stakeholders who can count are those who can bring money and bring money for their interest, to protect their interest. This is a crisis of democracy. This is a crisis of democracy that is getting more and more dangerous now that on the international scenario, I see the beginning of a new Cold War that won't be fought with armies and weapons, but with the market rules, commercial competition, and this is the situation we are in. It's true that multilateralism is in crisis, but I would like to start thinking, and maybe we need to find time to have this sort of discussion. What can be the response if multilateralism is in crisis? How to relaunch the values of multilateralism, as if it is in crisis. Multi-stakeholderism, I don't think can be the response, but I don't think either that the response can be nationalism. And we need to find a way out of that, because these are the two points of a contradiction that is endangering democracies worldwide. What we do as PSI? Well, we think that the experience we got with COVID, that, by the way, I consider is just an anticipation, of what can happen if we don't address seriously the issue of climate crisis. We need to be prepared to more and more pandemics. We need to be prepared to more and more massive movement of people because of the environmental threats. Millions of people will be confronted with in the future. With COVID, we understood that, first of all, when you underfund and you understaff health systems, you privatize the health facilities, and you allow profit to infiltrate a sector that is aimed to ensure a fundamental human right as health, problems will become more and more severe when a pandemic comes, as it happened with COVID-19. And we saw that in the privatized sector facilities, mortality has been higher both in patients and workers during the pandemic. We saw that the global supply chain failed to respond to the needs of population. And this is something we need to focus on, not only to make sure that each country has all the equipment that are needed in case of an emergency, but also because reducing the supply chain will reduce the footprint in terms of to reduce the carbon emission with the movement of goods across borders. And it doesn't seem to be on the agenda, this issue at all. We know that we need preparedness, and we need also the capacity to share the knowledge and the goods with all to face the pandemic with all the population around the world. The TRIPS waiver is key to allow all countries to produce and distribute vaccines, and being able finally to contain and control the virus, the COVID-19 spread for the future, as well as other disease that may happen again. But the issue of intellectual property is really very connected to the power that corporates can use to lobby government and to impose their interest on the national, local, and global agenda to protect their business. So this is something that we consider really, really very important. I need to say also that during the pandemic, everyone understood how important are public services, the workers in hospital, education, waste collectors, energy, transport, all the services that could help to maintain alive our communities and our societies at local level, based on the role of public service workers, in general, of service workers, not only public, but also private. I think, for instance, food distribution and things like that. But yeah, but public services are crucial, are fundamental, and they represent an important part of the disposable income for the least developed countries that we need to consider in order to reduce poverty and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, if we'll ever achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And investing in public service workers is important to recover from the pandemic, from the crisis, in a sustainable way. I would like to say that the greenest jobs we can imagine are the one in public service, in education, in health, in waste collector, in local transport, in the supply of energy, water, and sanitation. So investing in public services means also give instruments to a sustainable and environmentally and economically sustainable development. As I said, there has been several, we saw the failure of a privatized system over the years, and the damages that a market-based approach to the economy is creating. And we need to strengthen our alliance as well as our analysis in order to being able to face the future or to project a different future, an alternative future. Of course, we are talking about supporting the role of the state, investing in public services, giving back in public hands the privatized services. But I also think that we need to consider a system where the role of the public is leading the economy in the industrial sector and not only in the public sector. This is why it's so important that energy policies come back in public hands, and governments can play a role important in that direction. And of course, as public service workers, we are as a union, we are very much engaged in defining a role for trade union for workers in this sort of development with the possibility to participate. I must say that this 1 year and a half of remote meetings, online meetings, has restrained the space of participation for civil society and NGOs, and particularly for trade union within the global institution, included within the UN and within the ILO. So when I say that the declaration for the just transition that some of the rich countries, well, all rich countries signed during COP26 has a good language on workers, has a good language mentioning trade unions, but it never mentions public services, and it never mentions what means those words. So I'm very happy to see that there are commitments, there important principles are reaffirmed, but if they are not accompanied by serious measures, funding, resources, and a true commitment to help the developed world, they remain words on a paper. and nothing can change. Richard mentioned the work that we are doing together. We do believe that key to a change in this development model, key issues are a reform of the tax justice system, the agreement reached by the G20 and supported by the OECD is a step, but is totally insufficient. It's totally insufficient and will not help to fix the problem of a fair taxation and the fact that contribution that corporates and the financial system need to contribute to the recovery, to rebuild an economy that is fairer and more just. The debt campaign, we consider that it's time to deeply change the debt policies, not only suspend, postpone, reduce the payment of interest on debt. And this is particularly important for the developing, least developed countries, for the developing world, but it's important also for the developed world. We saw within Europe with the constraints of the Maastricht rules, how important is the possibility to govern, to use the debt in order to face emergencies such as the one we are still in with the COVID pandemic. And investing in public services is the consequence of changing these these two fundamental contradictions of our financial, global financial system, and reassigning a fundamental role to governments in order to address and to direct industrial policies. I will stop here just saying that maybe it is time also to start talking about progress, not only about development, as development has taken an enormous importance in terms of economic and never considers the social impact, the environmental impact, while in a broader sense, progress can encompass all these aspects. Well, maybe also start looking at the language we use can help defining alternative for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosa. That's excellent. Again, a very rich contribution, I think, that highlights a number of really important issues, not least of which being the need to maintain public services and public service workers really at the center of a vision of this alternative that we're looking for, and what that would mean for returning energy to public ownership, so that energy workers become public service workers, which I think would be a pretty and industrial workers as well, which would obviously be a pretty profound shift. As I mentioned, we've worked very closely, especially this year, with PSI around the report, and have been really grateful for the opportunity to do that. I should have mentioned another PSI colleague who I see is on the call, Daria Cibrario, who has played an invaluable role in that whole task force process. Daria is the local and regional government officer with PSI, and really pleased that she could join us today as well. Also, before we move on to the last speaker that we have scheduled from the panel, while I'm speaking about this task force process that we've been involved in this year, with PSI, FNME, the French Mining and Energy Workers Union, part of CGT, and 30 or so unions from around the world. Also part of that task force has been Transnational Institute, colleagues from there based in Amsterdam, TNI. And I want to acknowledge Satoko Kishimoto, who I see is on the call, who has been on that task force. Again, really grateful for their participation. So with that, then I want to move to Joshua Mata, who is General Secretary of Centro, which is a national center in the Philippines Federation. Joshua, if you're there and ready, I think I saw you earlier. Yep. Great.
Hi,
I'll hand
thanks,
over
John.
to you. Yep.
Thank you. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Special shout out to my friends and colleagues in the Philippines who's with us tonight. Thank you for inviting me to speak here. And at the onset, I want to say that we are one with the trade unions for energy democracy and all of you here in saying that indeed corporations can't deliver on the energy transition that we all badly need at this point in time. Oh, sorry about the background noise. I'm actually at the streets. Is it okay? Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes, it's fine,
Okay,
Joshua.
great.
Thanks.
But having said that, I'm afraid I have to say that the alternative narrative on energy that we wanted to hear, like energy being part of the global public goods, has yet to gain traction in my own country. And this is despite the consistent failure of the electric power industry privatization. You see, the EPIRA law, which privatized the electric power industry in the Philippines, is now on its 20th year. And we're doing a very comprehensive assessment of it. But at this point in time, I can already tell you that it has completely failed in delivering in every single point of its promise, from lowering the cost of electricity to increasing efficiency and to making sure that electrical connection of people, a power connection of people would be sustainable. So it has been a complete failure, and that already is should be an indictment of the privatization program. But and also at the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic has showed that privatized energy can't cope with the needs of the people during the pandemic, and that surely people now realize that they needed the state in order to make sure that everyone continues to be connected to the power grid, despite the fact that a lot of people have lost their jobs, and they're not able to pay their bills. So, but having said that, even if these things are happening, I'm afraid that the narrative of the neoliberals and the pro-marketeers are still very, very dominant, and that we need to really work hard to break through, to break through against this narrative. Let me give you a quick context first. Because I won't deal with the entire power industry, I would just deal with some section, with one section of which deals with about 2.36 million Philippine households, and that's essentially the subsector of the power industry that's serviced by electric cooperatives. So as I mentioned, approximately half of the households in the Philippines and the majority of those living in the rural areas are actually provided for by the electricity are actually provided for by electric cooperatives. Now, these electric cooperatives were built by the government way back in the 1960s, 1970s. And the government has spent billions in making sure that these electric cooperatives are able to actually distribute electricity to its consumer members. Right now, we have about 120 electric cooperatives in the country, and unfortunately, after having been provided for by the state for many years, now the government and a lot of the power moguls in the country wants to take them over. So there is now a strong push to privatize them or corporatize them, if you like. In fact, they've been trying to do this for many years now. One of the first things that we work with when we started working with the trade unions for energy democracy was in trying to defend the electric cooperative in one particular province called Albay in the Bicol region, where where a company took over and the union fought back and waged a three long year of strike. Now that strike failed in stopping the privatization, but it became so costly for the corporation to actually take over, so much so that now many corporations don't want to do it in the same way. So while we failed, while the failed strike, at the industrial level, it has nonetheless succeeded politically in making sure that corporations will no longer try and corporatize electric cooperatives in that way. But now they're moving around it, and then they're figuring, they're trying to do it this time using legislation. So, and I'll get back to that later on. So that's the reason why we're trying to fight them off, and then we're trying to defend the electric cooperatives. Why? Well, simply because, as I have mentioned already, that the privatization of electric cooperatives and electric power industry does not necessarily lead to the promise that it would lower the cost of electricity and make them much more efficient. In fact, as we have seen now in that particular province in Aleco or in Albay, where the corporation has taken over the electric cooperative, clearly it is being managed in as badly or even worse as it was before. I would even say that it's probably being it would have been the management previously was under being an electric cooperatives much better than it is being done today. But more importantly, we have also seen that that we cannot rely on privatized energy to transition to renewable energy. And I can say that very clearly that in the Philippines, while many corporations have started applying for franchises in order to build solar energy, mini hydro, and even wind energy systems, the fact is that many of these applications, while they have been already approved for many years, has not moved beyond the drawing boards, simply because they're waiting for the government to finance it. And apparently, the agenda is to wait for climate financing coming from the UNFCCC in order to finance these investments, so-called investments in renewable energy. So if the corporations themselves would not cough up money to do this, why do we have to wait for them? The states should just take over and do this for all of us. So that's the situation. But here's the problem, and just before I wind up, this is now the problem. The problem is, despite all these horrendous failures of the privatized privatized system that we now have, it's still business as usual for the Philippines. That's the problem, no? In fact, just this morning, we got word from the Senate that apparently the Senate Committee on Senate Committee on Franchises is intent on finally approving the application of the franchise application of a power company, which would in effect undermine several electric cooperatives, because now they're being given a franchise in a huge chunk of the Bicol region that would undermine at least 3 or 4 electric cooperatives. So that's a big problem that we're now facing. So what's the challenge for us? The challenge for us now is, first, we need to make sure that the people would actually defend the electric cooperatives. And to do so, it would be a great opportunity for us to educate them that public energy indeed should be kept within public hands. No? So that's the first challenge. No? Second, we need to make sure that the electric cooperatives themselves would now start moving into renewable energy. For us, and we did a study on this, it's very clear that as soon as electric cooperatives moves into generating its own renewable energy source, they could easily lower the cost of electricity. For in all the 120 electric cooperatives that we've studied, that is essentially the case. All they need is the proper financing, to enable them to do this. Now, is there money to do it? Well, definitely there's money to do it. If only government would have the political will to do it, they would be able to do it. I mean, the government the past 4 years has been spending, 5 years has been spending billions and billions of pesos for what they call as the build. But about 98% of that trillions of funding is actually for railway systems that would not be that people would not actually be able to use until around 4 or 5 years from now on. So what we're saying is that, well, while that's important, probably in the long run, it is much more important now, given the climate crisis that we're facing, that we should rather, shift this public investment into a much more bigger effort to ensure that we are building renewable energy for everyone. And if public financing remains to be a problem, if the government would still continue claiming that public financing is a problem, then we also are proposing one simple solution, and that's to tax the rich. Let's just tax the rich. After all, while all of us have suffered so much in this pandemic, we saw how much the wealth of a selected families in the Philippines and also in the world have tripled and even quadrupled, despite us, despite many of us going hungry. So to sum up, the alternative narrative that we'd like to hear has yet to be heard in the Philippines. And this is why we look forward to the release of the fantastic report that's being done by TUED together with the French unions, which they call the Program for a Public Low Carbon Energy Future in the early 2022. This, we believe, the release of this report will definitely help start framing the debate, not only globally, but also in the Philippines. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for that report, we will definitely work to start breaking through the dominant narrative, despite all the daunting challenges that we are facing today. Let me stop there, John, because I'm actually freezing out here. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Right. Thanks so much, Joshua, and thanks for your sacrifices, giving a presentation to the call from outside so that you'd be able to speak openly without a mask. Appreciate the sacrifice. That was very useful. Obviously, we're all, as much as we're able to follow what's happening in the Philippines, we know that it's an awful situation, and appreciate you always being able to be available, but in this case, even travel so far to join us for some of these important meetings and help us understand better some of the very, very difficult challenges that you and others in the Philippines are facing, especially here in the context of the pandemic, where I know it's been really brutal there. And I know that, some of the contributions so far have highlighted an issue that's been of ongoing interest throughout this process, which is this question about how we pay for things. And, as we're fighting to take back control over key processes and structures of power from corporate and private ownership, how do we also take full advantage of the spending power of the state, the public purse, recognizing that the constraints on that power are different in different contexts, and that in the South there are serious issues with external debt that obviously have to be addressed, but at the same time we should not be letting those states off the hook to do what they are able to do, but we need strategies and a framework for that, and I think that's part of the conversation that we're working out. And I know I've appreciated that Richard has also mentioned that, and as an area that we need to understand better and not shy away from, and kind of push our own understandings a little bit. Now, my understanding is that we have another speaker who's going to come in from the floor, which is David Gobet from the ITF. And I think if I am understanding correctly, David is the chair of the International Railway Committee of CGT France and of the ITF. And David, I'm not able to see you at the moment. I saw you earlier, and I apologize if I've
Oui, bonjour à tous et à toutes.
Yeah, great. Okay. Over to you, David.
D'accord. Merci.
Well, thank you. First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm David Gobet, the chair of the ITF Railway Workers section, and also I am French, as you might have heard, and I'm also the director of the International Center of the CGT Railway Workers Federation. ITF is launching a great campaign about the reappropriation of transport. We need to be aware that transports nowadays represent over 30% of green gas emissions, and therefore it is important that the ensemble of transport, it is an important leverage to lower green gas emission in general. Today, we have within COP26, and it is important for us to develop a public transport in order to respond to the climate stakes, but we also are launching a campaign on railroads in order to promote railroads, railways, which are compared to cars, a lot less polluting, railways which emit 14 times less than a truck for an equivalent transport in tons, and a high-speed train will emit 5 times less energies. And we have nowadays the possibility of promoting railway transport without discriminating against any other modes of transportation, meaning that railways cannot go everywhere on the planet. It must be complementary to other means of transportation. This is why we are both demanding for the railway to be complementary to aviation, maritime transport, and road transport. And we are also, and railroads, and this is what I'd like to insist on today, must be a public service on the planet. The majority of railway entities today are in their state control, not necessarily public control. And the trend is that many countries are liberalizing the railroads and railways. You can see this in a number of your countries, but we have the better possible results on the planet today, both in terms of passenger and merchandise transport. We can see that those are both integrated and public. So it is important to raise not only the need for public services in transport, the need for cooperation, and the need of complementarity. And where I would like to insist in terms of our railroad campaign, we do not want to be in disagreement with the demands of our colleagues from the energy sector. Not only do we demand a public strategy in terms of railroad, but we also must have a that we feel that the energy public is a great railroads is transport in general is a high user of energy, and we need to have a better north-south management of energy, because the energies of the south are very large in terms dependency in terms of the north and the south, and we want to have a coherence between the imposition that the states have both on energy and on hold of transport matters, and we want the energy to be as clean as possible, but we cannot demand of certain countries who do not have the necessary energy resources to give cleaner energies than others. And therefore we would like to join this campaign very clearly. We support the demands that you're carrying. We are in favor of private public partnerships. This is something that we'd like to state, and which we feel is very important. And also, I've just heard everything that was just said. And in the approach that it was just proposed, we feel we need to work all together, and we must work in a multi-sectorial way, because transport is linked to industrial transport, the mobility of people, and it is an element which is common to many sectors. And we must rethink the way we organize our public services, both in terms of governments and the need that we have for public transport and transport in general, and that public policies change in terms of governmental policies, and we must find a governance, and this is something our colleague Rosa has just spoken about, this a governance both in terms of the space of users associations, trade unions, other sectors that have to do with transport, state, of course, those who direct these companies. We must have a new governance in the way that for public services not to be the victims of those policies, because both energy and public transport are processes that must be led over not over 5-10 years, but over 10-30 years, which is why we need a long period of time in which to work. And this long period of time is not compatible with the profits that capital requires, which they, since they aim for short-term profit. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I would like to thank you for your invitation. And I believe Irene will share through messages or email links on your campaign, as well as a video that was just shared in the chat, a video about ITF, of why we promote railroad, while we promote green jobs, since railroad jobs are green jobs, and of course about the theme of the railroad campaign, which is articulated over 4 themes. First of all, railroad safety, which is an essential element of railroad production, as well as energy. Social justice, because there is a great disparity between the regions of the world, which see much too great gaps and inequalities, and also the recognition of trade unions and their rights to negotiate for fairer conditions. Everything in terms of the climate stakes and proposals in terms of energy, and finally, and as I said, well, social justice, security, and climate issues. And the 4th theme, which is extremely important to us, is the public reappropriation of railroads and public control of railroads. 4 pillars, which are articulated over 27 demands, and particularly some demands linked to energy, which refer to your concrete proposal. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, David. Always a pleasure to have someone from ITF on these calls. TUED and ITF go way back, and in fact, I think Sean initially worked on a report with and for ITF more than 10 years ago, and I think in fact predates TUED slightly, and was significant in shaping the understanding of the framework document for TUED as it took shape. I'm sure Sean can jump on and correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding. Is a little before my time, but the link with ITF's been very, very important over the years. Did you want to come in, Sean? I see you unmuted yourself.
I think we should probably open up discussion, but while we're waiting for hands to come up, yes, it was 2009, before the International Transport Workers Federation World Congress in Mexico City. The ITF, under the chair of Asbjørn Wahl, set up a climate committee. We worked for a year developing sort of a transport workers approach to climate protection, and a lot of that language is still in the discourse around an economy-wide approach, integration of energy democracy with transport democracy and public ownership. So it's very gratifying to see that work the ITF has done is really bearing fruit now in the debates. And I think that this is coming together in terms of the transport, energy, and there's still other sectors we need to work on, but giving some programmatic content, I think, to the global Green New Deal and the global public goods narrative is crucial at this point. But I won't say anything more about that right now.
Great, thanks, Sean. I do want to, I think, open it up for questions from the floor at this point. And there is already a question to Richard in the chat, which I'll read in a moment. But I just want to check in with Richard, because my understanding is that he may need to leave a bit early. I just want to make sure that we've got time with you, Richard. Are you going to need to jump off?
No, it's okay. I had a 12:30, but it's been cancelled.
Okay.
So that should be all right now.
Excellent. Okay. Well, in that case, I don't see any other hands at the moment, so I'm going to take this first question from the chat. And then I see Sam Mason from PCS, who will be first in the stack. But I'll read this out in case there are people on the call who don't have access to the chat, or if they're on their phones or something and may not have seen it. So this is a question from Richard Chilvers to Richard Kozelwright. What proposal do you have for a new model for a financial superstructure to replace the dollar? Oops, it just jumped. To replace the dollar and rejig the World Bank and IMF mandates as an international currency replaced by a green climate emergency bond, including progressive cancellation of debt and interest as part of reconfiguring world development based on leveling up across all continents? And I'll stop there. I think the rest is a sort of repetition of the question. Richard, want to respond to that?
Okay, yeah, I mean, it's a key question, of course, and not an easy. I mean, the question of the dollar hegemony is not something I think we can. I mean, there are efforts at the regional level to do that, but we don't work on the assumption that the dollar is going to be replaced anytime soon. It's a major it's a potential constraint, but there is no. I don't think there's a lot of talk about the demise of the dollar, but I don't see that happening without wider changes that need to be made. First of all, in the multilateral financial architecture, and there are a couple that I think are coming out of the pandemic situation that we need to build on. One is the issue around debt. Rosa mentioned this, around debt restructuring, debt cancellation. I mean, and it's an old UNCTAD challenge. This is a missing element in the international financial architecture, the need to have some sort of multilateral mechanism to deal with sovereign debt problems when they emerge. We think is going to be critical for solving this challenge and allowing developing countries to effectively mobilize their own resources. The situation right now is one, not only is it very ad hoc, most of the responses are too little and too late. Most of the responses continue to genuflex to private creditors who have become the big players in this architecture over the last 2 or 3 decades. That needs to be contested quite clearly. And at least for us, the way to do that is through an independent, rules-based institution that can bring the creditor and the debtor into a neutral space to thrash out a reasonable solution. In a way, the parallel is always with the bankruptcy rules at the national level that to some extent allow that to happen. We've made proposals. I think some of the work we did with PSI is very much in that direction as well. The IMF, we shouldn't be in the IMF. I think it's very important to say that the IMF is a creditor. It's not an appropriate institution to, I think, handle these kinds of issues. It tried itself in the early 2000s to move in the direction of promoting a sovereign restructuring mechanism. It was immediately resisted by the US Treasury and other advanced economies. I think it's still. I think there has been noises, including from the European Union, about something, but I think it's something that we need to push much harder for. Simply because without serious debt restructuring and cancellation, we just don't think many developing countries will ever be able to be in a position to deliver on the sustainable development goals. So that's a real critical. I think there needs to be another push in that direction if we're going to create the kind of alternative architecture that Richard mentioned in his question. There is some. As a second thing that's come out of the pandemic, clearly, there is a new discussion around the role of special drawing rights, which is the international reserve asset that the IMF can issue. And a number of people at the COP have picked up that. I mean, the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Motley, has suggested that we should be able to issue special drawing rights, a kind of special environmental drawing right, on an annual basis to the tune of $500 billion a year to provide some of the financing for meeting the climate challenge. There are lots of both mechanical and political obstacles to moving in that direction, but clearly the issuance of $650 billion by the IMF earlier this summer opens up that discussion further, and I think that's again something that we need to introduce as part of a discussion on reforming the international financial architecture. And I think, of course, finally, I mean, I guess the kind of cruel thing about the climate challenge is that we're not short of financial resources to meet this challenge. I mean, if you look at the kind of basic numbers, which is, and the developing countries, for example, have now, I don't know how, but a group of them announced, I think yesterday, that the kind of number that they want to see being discussed in the COP is in the order of $1.3 trillion per year, which is a number that is actually close to the kinds of numbers that we've been putting out in UNCTAD. That's for both adaptation and for mitigation investments. And I mean, it's, you know, in a world that has just kind of created $17 trillion worth of central bank money over the course of the last 18 months, this should be a doable. It should be a doable number. And when you add the whole question of repurposing subsidies from military expenditure, from subsidies to existing carbon-based fuel production and consumption, when you add in kind of food waste, you know, when the world is not, and when you add the kind of ability of financial institutions to generate credit, I mean, we're not, the financing itself is not the problem. You know, the ability to generate the resources to meet the kinds of investment is not the problem. Clearly, it's a political question, and whether the rules of the game are designed in a way that financial resources are channeled in an appropriate direction or not, and clearly they are not at the moment. But you know, I think pushing hard on some of these areas that have been exposed by the pandemic is, I think, critical to the kind of positive agenda that Rose has talked about. I mean, we can't just constantly bang on about the failure of the system. We need to constantly offer alternatives, and I think issues around debt restructuring, issues about using some of the underutilized financial mechanisms that are already in place are critical of that. Beyond that, you know, there's a question about, I mean, we believe very strongly that the multilateral development banks and the access to concessionary financing has to be a critical part of this story in terms, at least, I mean, certainly for developing countries. I mean, there is a serious question to be asked about whether we need new financing institutions to do this in response to not only the climate challenge, but other public good challenges around health and other issues, and whether, you know, we can't rely on the bank and the IMF as the institutions to do that. And I think, I mean, and people have talked about the need for a kind of global climate bank of some kind that might be a more appropriate way of mobilizing and channeling resources to meet these challenges. And that's that discussion, I don't think, has taken hold in a very systematic way over the course of the last 12 months. But I think it's something that, I mean, I think we need to be bold about, even if they sound implausible at the moment, I think we need to be bold about offering these kinds of alternatives, of grounding them in a convincible analytical framework and seeing what kind of traction we can build around them. And I think, I mean, that's something that I think around the global Green New Deal narrative we are trying to do. So, I don't think we should be overly. I mean, it's easy to be pessimistic given the attitude, particularly of advanced economies, to these issues. But when you kind of look at what is out there, I think there are real opportunities to present a more positive agenda in terms of reforming the financial system.
Great. Thank you, Richard. Excellent. Great question, really important issue, and that's a really rich, thoughtful and thought-provoking response. I know it's an ongoing point of very active reflection for us at UED and for many of the people on the call here about, what is this shifting understanding of finance that's come out of the past couple of crises, and how do we build on it, take advantage of it, and at the same time, it doesn't remove the constraints around foreign currency debt in developing countries and the raw materials requirements, the inputs for technologies and so forth. But if the financing itself doesn't need to be a constraint, then how do we need to rethink the whole question of affordability? Right, it sort of deals with other issues.
I mean, I would say in that context, John, I mean, the need, of course, to re-regulate private capital has to be, top of any agenda, because without that reining in that kind of power and influence, I think the obstacles to advancing a positive agenda are significant. So the call for re-regulation. The call for public banks as an alternative, that's got to be critical, at the national level as well as at the national level, has to be critical to any kind of progressive agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. I know we've got Sam Mason from PCS who had put a hand up. Sam, can you come in?
Yeah, thanks, John. Can you hear me okay? Great, thanks. Yeah, thanks to all the speakers. I mean, really excellent contributions, of course, and PCS is obviously really proud to be supporting the work of CHUED and this project with FNME and CGT and PSI as well, and being, one of the early signers on to the program, because we think this is really important and coming at a particularly important juncture. And I think, as Sean sort of said really in some of the opening remarks, referring to the comments from Prince Charles, and having had the opportunity to participate last week in the sort of working group meeting in Glasgow, I think it's they should really be the alarm bells and signals for us, from Alex Sharma calling that the bankers the new sort of swampies and eco warriors, and Mark Carney as well, of course, in his role as the UN envoy, and about the new finance architecture for net zero, or net zero being the new architecture for finance, and that's really what we're up against. So I was really pleased as well to hear you say, Richard, about these comments about people not being left behind, people already left behind, and we're still sort of talking in this phase, particularly in the trade union movement, about a just transition, that this is some point in the future that we're trying to reach towards. But of course we are already in that transition, and we very much saw a lot of these shifts happen in the pandemic as well. There was a lot of opportunism going on there, and behind the scenes of the pandemic to change things as well. So I think there's just two things to me I wanted to point out, or sort of raise and questions as well, mainly from the trade union side. I think the programme is really excellent, because it's not just about saying, we've got to reverse privatisations and, what we're against. It's really putting forward, and as you just said, Richard, a kind of real progressive alternative that we can all collectivise around. But we need to collectivise, and it's how we're going to do that and make this not just a sort of high level programmatic demands, but really bring these down into our unions, from the global to the national to the local, to somewhere like my union, we're a civil service trade union, And I can't remember who made the comment now about, some of the energy sector not seeing themselves as public service workers, because that chimes with where we've had privatizations in the civil service, and where, we call for them to be civil servants, and that's even down to cleaners, and people think, and the mindset now is so embedded around the whole privatization agenda that it's very difficult to shift that into that, all these workers are public sector workers, and that's how we should be seeing it. But I think Rosa had commented on, obviously, about the democracy, and certainly it's not just specific to the UK by any means. I mean, we see what the Johnson government is doing in terms of just the authoritarian behavior that's starting to happen, but also from a trade union perspective, we have something which we say, and I'm stealing it from an employment lawyer, but without the right to strike, our collective bargaining is just collective begging. And I think that's very much the case, because we have to also talk about, alongside this agenda, how we build our own power and rights, and particularly given that obviously a large amount of the global labour force are not in trade unions as well. I'm not, they're not necessarily not organised, but they're not in trade unions. So I think we have to start to address these questions also as part of this, and also build on, we saw some great mobilisations, and I've been part of the COP26 coalition of really trying to get a strong trade union presence on the streets last Saturday amongst the demonstrations. And it's the first time, we've really seen big blocks of trade union mobilisation, but we've got to take this forward. It can't just be that we've put all this energy into the COP. So it'd be good to hear a bit more from some of perhaps the trade union speakers about what's going to happen after next week, when everybody goes home and this pressure is off. How do we keep this pressure up? We've had some really good collaborations in the UK, for example, amongst some of our trade unions. We've made great statements, but they've got to go beyond great statements. And I suppose that the final thing to that is also about building our knowledge, because I know it's one of the discussions obviously we've had around developing the programme, about not being shy from using the language and changing the language and making sure we understand, because if we're going to win these arguments and win these fights, we've got to understand the language of the opposition. And it may be uncomfortable to talk, and I said this before about, power purchase agreements and all this kind of stuff, but if we don't understand the game, then we're not going to be able to change it. And I think when we had quantitative easing and stuff like this come in, that was one of our challenges then, and we've got to get very serious about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Up next, we had a question from Colin Long in the chat, which I think I'll read out, and I think it kind of builds in interesting ways on parts of what Sam was just saying here. Colin is the president of the Victorian Trades Hall Council in Australia and is up very, very late at night right now to be on with us. So we appreciate that. But Colin is asking, this is a general question, I think, to the speakers and to all of us on the call. During the 20th century, the labor movement worked closely with social democratic parties to advance progressive policies. Given the collapse of most social democratic parties or their abandonment of the working class, what new forms of political organization will be needed to advance our agenda? And I think it'd be interesting to hear from the union folks, PSI, ITF, Centro, STUC, the Scottish Trades Union Council, who are on the call as well. And then maybe, I don't know whether Richard at some point might want to come back and reflect on their contributions. Let me also say, I'm not seeing any other hands at the moment. If other people do have, I see one from Joshua now. I just went to gallery and saw. So Joshua, I'll bring you in. But if others have contributions they'd like to make, please use the hand up function in the Zoom or put a comment in the chat. So I've got Joshua, and then I see.
I hope. Oh, thanks, John. I hope you don't mind if I don't put on my video anymore.
Nope, that's fine.
Just so that I can keep my signal strong. That's actually a very good question, and I do believe that we need to accept the fact that the historic division of labor between the labor movement and the social democratic parties, or any party similar to it, where the party represents us in the government, and the labor movement takes care of the working class and their specific concerns. I think that historic division of labor has already collapsed. No? And having said that, I'm not implying that we don't have any need for any political party. That obviously is not what I'm saying. I think that what I wanted to say is to make sure that the labor movement itself must have the capacity to act without the necessary mediation of political parties, but is ready to work with political parties whenever it is, of course, to our advantage to do so. Now, that would require a much more politicized labor movement, labor movement that's more ready to act directly, politically, and not only to press things inside government if we can, but more importantly outside, as we have always been doing.
Yeah, thanks, Joshua. Great. Rosa, over to you.
Well,
and then I have Manuela from RLS. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a very complex question, this one, because if it's true that the progressive parties, along with all the political system we knew in, the 60s, the 70s, is collapsed and is no longer strong and in the position to represent the different part of the society, including workers. The trade union movement reflects this crisis as well. We are part of the society, and there's a global crisis of representativeness that I think has to be analyzed, and we need the courage to say also what is not working within the trade union movement. I think that one important and fundamental step, the first from my perspective, is to stop the co-optation of workers' organization, trade union representative within the system. Do we really need to be part of the World Economic Forum? Do we really need to be part or to sit in, contest where the interest of corporates and financial institutions of business are, the aim of the organization, rather than democratic institutions where everyone has the possibility to raise the voice. I think this is the first step. The second is to strengthen the alliance with the progressive forces we are working with. In the society, at local level, at global level, there are democratic organizations such as the one here, but also many others with whom we need to strengthen our relationship and more open our policies, our capacity to elaborate policies, not only to the theme of trade union rights, but also to the theme of democratic themes to strengthen democratic society. The participation of workers, of civil society, of the intermediary bodies of the society, as they used to be called in the past, is crucial to have real democracy. And then I think we need more courage, more boldness, more capacity to be radical in our claims. That doesn't mean not to mediate in the interest of workers. This doesn't mean, but the perspective has to be bolder.
Excellent. Thank you, Rosa. Manuela, would you like to come in? Manuela Kropp is with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in Brussels and has some knowledge of the political left in Europe, I believe. So.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks for the nice introduction. Yeah, Manuela Kropp, Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, Brussels. I have a question to David from ITF concerning the workers in the road transport sector and in the railway sector. I think, and I'm clear that's already your position, that we need a kind of just transition for workers which might lose their jobs in the road sector. When we finally achieve the necessary transition in the transport sector to meet the fight against climate change. So what are your proposals? What are your concrete ideas in this regard, how to prepare the workers in the road transport sector? Thanks.
Thanks, Manuela. David, I don't know if you'd want to come back since that's a question specifically to you, if you want to respond to that. Yeah.
Oui, alors je pense que tu veux parler de l'ensemble des transports. Effectivement, aujourd'hui,
I think you wish to speak of the ensemble of transport. Well, I'm thinking today about the aviation sector, which is very much affected by the COVID-19 crisis, for instance, and of the governmental measures, notably in France and Belgium, whom I've just reduced or at least cut transport for lines of less than 500 kilometers where railroad transport is available. And we need to have a solution for transport workers in order to there are skills in transport which are common to a lot of workers, and workers who can be and should be reclassified, if I may say this way, in other companies, in other transport sectors, and not just in the transport sector actually, but also in other sectors which are not necessarily transport sectors, in which there are common skills to be applied. And this is a question we've raised within ITF. I think many people are online. And yes, this is important because there is, on one hand, the transition of employment of more polluting jobs and jobs that would be more respectful of the environment. There is that transition, but there is also an increase in transport needs. And therefore, we do not know how these jobs will react. We do know what the future will be. We'll always need planes. We'll always need maritime transport. And we must answer, unfortunately, to industrial production, which is today based on a capitalistic model. And of course, we are in agreement with the shorter production models. We do not agree with merchandise having to go 3 times around the planet before reaching our plate. We are, of course, in agreement with that, and we don't want more transport for that. And we do not want more transport to take workers further away from their places of work and from their places where they live. But we do need transport for people, and this is where the articulation between the various modes of transportation are extremely important and must be taken into consideration while while considering sustainable development needs. And depending on the merchandise that is being transported, it is stupid today to say to have a merchandise train in competition with a slow boat which can go along rivers, or a truck, between trucks and trains, because this competition between various transportation modes are augmenting competition between workers, and is feeding the social device between workers. But with a true cooperation within the various transport sectors, workers sector by sectors will be stronger to negotiate just working conditions, just salaries. And this is the aim of our proposal. It is complementarity between modes of transportation, and the question of the transition is absolutely essential in this element. I hope I've answered your question.
Thanks. I see a hand next from Rodolfo and then Sean. And I think Sean wants to pose a question to or come back to Rosa in response to Rosa. So Rodolfo.
Hola.
Yeah.
¿Ahí se escucha bien?
Yes, we can hear you. Okay, well, I would like to greet everyone from Argentina, from the Workers Central of Argentina, CTAA, this event, and also to give gratitude for the opportunity to go to Glasgow and participate in the activities that TUED has organized, namely the event on the 4th of November. CTAA signed on to the program, the trade union program, and we are proud to have done so. And I think it responds to many of the challenges in our region, especially with regards to the challenges that free trade agreements pose to Argentina. And also we've seen that the hydroelectric system, both as it relates to transportation and distribution, passes through many of the challenges mentioned in today's talk, and the alternatives that are outlined. I am a worker in the system and have seen firsthand some of the challenges of this neoliberal model. That's my first point. My second point is that this relationship between the political parties, the political system, and trade unions must be increasingly coherent. In Argentina and in our region, we are seeing a series of elections coming up, and the pandemic has contributed to the formation of the terrain on which the electoral debates are happening. And I think many in our continent, we see, this constant tension. On the one hand, the popular recuperation of public services. For example, in Bolivia, we've seen this with not just the retaking and reclaiming of public services, but also reclaiming governance from a coup that we saw happen in Bolivia. And in Peru, we also see something similar, with Castillo, who is a teacher, a public teacher from the rural regions, winning the presidency. And whenever we see those progresses, we see a counter-offensive, and that occurs throughout the region. The tipping point that has been mentioned here in this call in reference to the rhetorical point that has been mentioned in COP. I think when we talk about the tipping point, we need to talk about these bolder revolutionary transformations, a tipping point that seeks to actually resolve the source of the crisis. And neoliberalism has created its own crisis, and it has created these openings for opportunities for revolutionary practice that we have to take on. And I want to mention, for example, the topic of the debt. There's been green bonds in Argentina. Macri in Argentina has condemned us to 100 years more of being tied to the IMF and to debt payments to creditors, and also, of course, to the commodification of nature, which is linked to these green bonds. And maybe on another hand, I just want to greet and send my solidarity from Argentina to this talk. And I just appreciate everything that has been organized around the COP coalition and also specifically by TUED. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rodolfo. Sean, I want to bring you in next. Then we've got Asbjørn on stack.
Yeah, very briefly, just David from ITF, there was an error in the interpretation. He said they endorsed public partnerships over public-private partnerships. I think that, with due respect to the interpreters, I think that got missed, and it came out as an endorsement of public-private partnerships. At least that's how I heard it. So I wanted to make that point. But more precisely on the question that raised by Rosa about the need to be bold, of course, we completely concur. But I also think we're actually in a very strong position, and the timing is right for us to be more assertive in the way Rosa suggested. When I look at the work of what PSI is doing, what ITF is doing, and what TUED has been doing, it is very deeply grounded in a reality, and it says what needs to be done, however difficult that might be in political terms at the moment. We are at least basing our analysis on the facts. In contrast, I think there's still many in the trade union movement who are content to go along with the idea that there's, it's a seat at the table, the transition is happening, and we just got to cheer on the renewable energy companies and the liberal kind of, if there is such a thing, investor class. And that, I think, is a big mistake. And the illustration of this just came out today. David Boyes on this call from PSI sent me the statement of the B team, which is a group of business leaders, including, at least until recently, Richard Branson, who's notoriously anti-union, with the C40 network and ITUC. And, it basically said, we need to have an energy transition, decarbonize the power sector, and don't forget about the poor. And it is, where is the analysis there to ground a new narrative that we need in the trade union movement? So I think being bold is easier when you know you've got the facts at your fingertips. And that's, I think, one of the challenges, is to turn the analysis that we've developed inside the trade union movement for a more transformative vision into messages that can be taken up inside the movement, because I think otherwise it goes into this default position of no worker left behind, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Sean. Asbjørn Waval, over to you. Asbjørn, Sean mentioned Asbjørn earlier. They had worked together some time back on the transport document that we referred to, and Asbjørn's a long-time supporter, participant at TUED. Go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you also for this great meeting. It's really, really good to be part of a meeting like this, dealing with the most challenging problems we face, and also coming up with proposals and what to do. I want to comment on one thing, that as you know, I come from Norway, which is a country with a very, very strong public control of the energy sector, both the hydroelectric electricity in Norway, which cover more than 90% of the of the energy, of the electricity, and also later on in history we became an oil producing country. The thing is that both the hydroelectric energy and the oil company in Norway have all the way been controlled by the public sector. In spite of that, it has changed a lot from being in the post-war period a system which made electricity as part of the commons in a way, and what has happened over the last 25 years is that it has not been a privatization of energy, but it has been a commodification and a marketization of the system. And so the important thing I think to have in mind that public ownership, it's not enough if we want to control and develop the energy sector, because they can make rules which marketize the sector. The hydroelectric energy in Norway today is completely marketized. It is still more than 90% owned by public, by the state or by municipalities and so on. So we have to be aware of that. It is not only right-wing politicians or governments that can privatize or marketize the energy sector. It is also made through the neoliberalization of the state itself. And that is important because a lot of things have happened to the state in the last 30, 40 years, which have completely changed this post-war institutions that we had. In Norway, that was completely out of the market in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But when the neoliberal policy got control more or less in the 1980s and 90s, it led to the privatization of the marketization of the electricity. And that was made in the 1990s and 2000, mainly by social democratic governments in Norway. So it was part of this neoliberalization of the state. The role of the state has changed also. So to talk about privatization today is not the same as it was in the period when the state was a Keynesian state, we can say. So it is important, the question which is raised now, so what kind of resistance can we develop against this? And what about the need for a political party? I think that those are questions that we have to discuss much more, because there is a crisis on the left. There is a crisis in the left, in the political left, but also in the left in the trade unions. And I really think that we have to address these problems, both how neoliberalism form the state, and also how we can develop political institutions and parties of the new sort, which can be able to meet these challenges. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Asbjørn. A sobering reality check here at the end, although I know it's something we're all painfully familiar with. And we are right up against time. If people need to jump off, obviously they can. I don't want to end it just here. If people may want another couple minutes, I want to give Rosa in particular a chance to come back if she would like to, maybe Richard as well, and any of the other speakers. Also, just quickly in response to the point Asbjørn was making, in the task force work that we've been doing in these recent months, this issue of the need to demarketize, decommodify energy has been absolutely at the heart of those debates and discussions. In the framing, the program that we mentioned earlier, and I'll put the links in the chat again here, it's the challenge there, or the commitment there, is articulated in terms of the need for a new mandate for public energy companies to deliver electrical power in particular, but energy more generally, in ways that are not captive to market forces and that meet a pro-public or a public goods criterion, principle, approach. Obviously, we're still working out the language and the details practically for that, but I just to highlight for people that is absolutely at the heart of what we've been grappling with and trying to figure out how to tackle. So, Rosa, I don't know if you want to come back. If you don't, that's fine, but I'll give you a chance.
Well, I don't have anything to add. I think the discussion we had this morning is very important, and we need to deepen our thinking together in order to build the future. We are in a good position. Richard said that this is a good moment. Yes, I also think that this is a good moment because all the contradictions are on the table, and it's easier for us to highlight those aspects. We need to use our knowledge, our competencies, and our proposals to drive the idea of an alternative, and that an alternative is possible.
Thank you. Excellent. So much. David from ITF, I don't know if you want to come back. Again, if not, that's fine. I'll just give you a chance. Or Richard, I see you there. If you, okay, I see David. Are you saying no?
Oui, une dernière intervention, parce qu'après, je vais devoir vous quitter, mais je suis tout à fait d'accord avec...
One last thing, because I'll have to leave. I completely agree with Comrade Asbjorn. We in France make a difference between state companies and national companies. We consider that to give companies back to states is not the same thing as nationalizing corporations or entities. The difference also between national entities and monopolies. We feel that a state service will be a company as service that will be monopolized within a capitalistic process, whereas a national corporation is, or entity is, one that will belong to the nation, and it is for the nation to decide how it will function. It is true that in France, in our debates on public services, we make a true difference between state-owned entities and nationalization, and which is why we're speaking of governance systems that shouldn't go through major changes for every change, particularly in key sectors such as energy, transport, and water. It is something that I wanted to add, but I thank you for this excellent debate. It will be a great pleasure to see you. I should be here tonight physically at the debate as well. So thank you and see you later. Thank you.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you, David. I believe Joshua's had to jump off. His phone battery died, so I can't bring him back in. But Richard, if you'd like to have a final closing minute or two.
Thanks, John. I mean, I think my phone battery is about to die too. I mean, the same struggle in a way with the question of social democracy. I mean, they were, you know, in our world, and certainly with the new international economic order, it was European social democracy, parties from the European social democracy that were engaging constructively with developing countries around that issue. That no longer is the case. I agree with Asbjorn that, I mean, in a way, it was social democracy that embraced and amplified neoliberalism in many countries, not just around privatization, but around, for example, the independence of the central bank was in many European countries advanced by social democratic governments, and that's a huge obstacle, I think, to a progressive agenda, given the power that central banks actually have to be able to, we need to talk about the democratization again of the central bank and what role it can play in a just transition. I think that's incredibly important. So I mean, that political aspect is something that we struggle with. I guess, I think the one thing that we need to keep hold of is that there have been these moments in recent years in which the role of organized labor and left of center governments have have reappeared. That was true in the UK under Corbyn. I mean, they have been ephemeral moments. I think to some extent, I think we can see that under Biden. It's not going, I don't think it's going in the direction we had hoped maybe 6 months ago. But you know, Labour is in the United States is becoming more, it seems to be at least willing to confront a capital in certain types of sectors of the economy, and there's more, and there isn't a pushback against that from the Biden administration that we've seen in earlier administrations. I mean, there are kind of areas where we should take some degree of optimism about the importance of the voice of Labour in propelling a more progressive agenda, and that's true in the South, I think, as well. I guess it would, you know, I mean, it's the discussion I think has been fascinating. I really, you know, listening to everybody and listening and thinking about where we come from in terms of our agenda. I mean, there's just a lot of overlap now that we need to develop and promote better, I think. I mean, it's a failing of our world that we're not very good at kind of advancing a positive agenda and engaging with more progressive groups. I mean, I think it's been mentioned a number of times the way in which the UN has embraced the financial sector, for example, which I don't see as a positive step forward. But you know, I do take optimism. In my, you know, we first advanced the notion of a global Green New Deal back in 2009, around the time of the Copenhagen COP, and this moment feels better. It feels like there feels to be more opportunities at this moment in time than proved to be the case in 2008, 2009, and you know, I do take some solace from that state of affairs, even though it is easy. You know, it's back to Gramsci's pessimism of the mind, optimism of the will, really. And I do see the need to constantly promote alternatives that, even if they feel a little bit far out there, you know, serve a purpose of countering the neoliberal narrative, which has become so dominant over the course of the last 30 or 40 years.
Right. Thank you so much, Richard. I think any meeting that ends with a reference to Gramsci can be counted at least inspiring, and certainly got something pointed in the right direction. I want to thank everyone. I think we're going to have to close now. Thank you for everyone sticking on who stayed to the end. Thank you to the interpreters. Just so I